Again, thank you very much for everyone coming along to this webinar hosted by Cleverciti. So this is a real informative webinar where we're just trying to, give an education from a couple of partners' point of view as well as our own about the road to electrification and how parking data can assist local authorities with that transition. So we've got some great speakers for you today. So we're starting with Julian O'Kelly, who's from the British Parking Association, and he's head of technology, innovation and research. So Julian helps BPA and its members to understand and respond to the opportunities posed by carbon reduction, energy, data alongside some active travel. He's got numerous experience in leadership and research roles across the public and private sector. And today he's going to talk about some things that the BPA are doing in relation to EV charging, as well as national initiatives, including Park Active, which he's going to talk about as well. We also have Sarah Clements from Element Energy. So Sarah is a senior consultant dedicated to electric vehicle charging projects. She combines knowledge of the UK's EV charging infrastructure market with strategies and development for local authorities, project management for large deployment projects, and she works with a range of stakeholders to ensure access to charging infrastructure is no longer a barrier to electrification. We also have Hugh Mackenzie, the COO of Trojan Energy. So he's a mechanical engineer with 20 years of experience within the oil industry, which he's going to talk about, and obviously saw the light and came over to the EV world. So they're going to talk about residential on-street charging. And then myself and David Parker, the COO of Cleverciti, we're going to talk about the relation of parking data and how we use that data in order to better understand where we're going to put charge points and guide customers to charging locations and things like that. So to start with, I'm going to pass straight over to Julian from the BPA.
Thank you very much, Chris, and absolute pleasure to be here today to share with you what we're up to at the BPA. So a bit of background: British Parking Association, it's Europe's largest non-for-profit trade association that covers both parking and the wider world of mobility, which certainly includes electric vehicles these days. As a sector, as a transport sector, we've got a long way to go when we compare ourselves, for example, to the energy sector to do our bit with reducing carbon emissions and greenhouse emissions. And this is even more acute now that we're all in lockdown, ordering bits and bobs from Ocado to Amazon and so on, and the white vans are pulling up, many of which are not electric. So as a sector, not only we're responsible for parking, but we're responsible for emissions related to parking. And I think Chris later will talk about how a big part of the problem is finding a parking space and the emissions related to that and so on. Next slide, please, Chris. And we know from when restrictions were eased last year that there is a big danger of a repetition of a car-led recovery and of people driving to all those beautiful spots we've got around the country. And that was Snowdonia, but also Bournemouth. You may have seen in the media parking chaos. I think it was described, people just parking willy-nilly, driving as close as they could to their destination. And there's no sign that we're all suddenly going to be thinking about different means of transport after the pandemic. If anything, the reliance will continue. And added to that, we've got the pressure of clean air zones that are going to be rolled out across the country. You can see there Oxford at the moment is planning a clean air zone in the centre, but it's going to expand. It's expanding across the country. Bath, I think, has come on stream just recently. So we all need to think about electric vehicles, but we need to think about how we facilitate that. And the BPA represents local authorities as well as corporate clients. We have about 290 local authorities as members, and they range from local authorities that are very advanced in how they've managed to think ahead and develop a strategy for EV infrastructure. And there are smaller, perhaps less well-resourced local authorities who face a range of challenges, and I'll put them there. First of all, of course, local authorities don't tend to run petrol stations before, so how would they know how to set up an EV infrastructure from scratch? There's a lack of in-house know-how and experience in this field. And they're all worried about stranded assets and making sure the equipment's future-proof, things like whether it can be updated remotely, where it's placed, where is the demand going to be the highest, how do they find that out? Then there's the funding issues, which the government funding, of course, will taper off and that incentive will go. So local authorities have to be very creative about how they get funding for the infrastructure. But specific to local authorities, of course, there are the political challenges. If you've got a political cycle that's 1 or 2 years, that might well be at odds with an energy strategy or an EV strategy that needs to think 5, 10 years ahead. It's very difficult sometimes to procure innovative ideas because some very antiquated procurement procedures are in place that don't really incentivize something that's not tried and tested. You've got the public attitudes element. We're going to hear about pop-up charge points later, but certainly there is a concern around street clutter, around EV charge points being put where there aren't so many EV drivers. And then there's the social equality angle. In Dundee, for example, 51% of residents don't have a driveway. So what do you do for those that don't have a driveway and are not likely to get an EV because of lack of charge points? Well, at the BPA, because we represent so many local authorities, I'm lucky enough to hear some stories of some really good use cases and best case scenarios. And here's one that's really caught my eye. In Oxfordshire, they've got the Park and Charge scheme where they've teamed up with Scottish and Southern Electrics, and they've got a demonstrator project that is looking at how charge points can be offered in car parks that can be conveniently located to areas where there's a large area of people who don't have charge points. And that addresses that gap where you've got people who want to have EVs, can't charge at home, they park the car in the car park overnight, get a free or a very cheap charge, and that barrier has been removed. They're rolling that out across the county eventually, and it'll be interesting to see how that goes nationally, because I think there's a great role for parking to play in that respect. Next slide, please, Chris. And then there's a whole area of integrated energy systems in car parks. Very often you have a large surface area at the top where you can have solar, or you can have surface car parks with solar canopies. There's enough solar that you can get certainly in the picture on the right, to power not just the EVs, but the whole car park. And that resolves the problem of lack of grid supply. Other examples, you've got that in Cambridge as well at their park and ride in Bradburn. Pop-up, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that because we're going to hear about some great innovations from Hugh later around that. And next slide, please. Parking can go hand in hand with EV charging when it comes to dynamic ways of pricing and reducing congestion. So in Dundee, again, they put cheaper charging and parking on the outskirts to incentivize people to then walk or cycle into the centre. And they're even investing in robots, but I won't dwell on that. That's future scanning. Now, the BPA is playing its part in another area that relates to EV charging. We are working with the government to support a national parking platform. We were involved in a proof of concept in Manchester, where parking operators, whether they're NCP, Q Park, whoever, aggregate their data, send it up to a parking platform, and the other side, whatever app you've got, whether it's Just Park, Ringo, whoever, you can access that aggregated availability data across the across the private and the public sector. So this is a way of taking away parking pain, but also charging pain, because of course, this whole system, which is powered by a data standard we've been leading on at the BPA with our European compartments, sorry, get my words out, our European and American partners, the Alliance for Parking Data Standard provides a data standard that all of this works on, and it includes EV charging. Next slide. Moving back from the specifics of EV charging on its own, what we are really encouraging our members to think about is parking spaces as mobility spaces. Rather than it just being a place where you go as close as you can to your destination, a parking space can also be a place, obviously, where you charge your car, but then you consider other means of transport to get to your final destination, whether it's a scooter, an e-bike, bike, or walk, or maybe shared transport, shuttle, etc. And this is very much the thinking behind a really exciting initiative that I'm pleased to be involved in called Park Active. Park Active was very much inspired by all of the facts that we know around active travel and what they can do for the health and wealth of the nation. You can see there that you can increase footfall when you plan walking environments around towns. We know from our own research that people are prepared to walk 5 to 10 minutes from their parking space to the high street. And we know about all of the health benefits, of course, that come with active travel. Next slide, please. Government is behind it, both in England and Scotland. You've probably heard of the 10-point plan, gear change. And only yesterday I heard of Green Recovery Fund is now releasing another 40 million for innovative research and projects around improving the environment. And here we have, thank you, you're moving ahead at speed there, Chris. So moving on to what we're doing at the British Parking Association. This is Park Active. That's our landing page. You can see the URL down the bottom left hand. Please go and have a look. This is an initiative where we're encouraging our public and private sector operators to embrace active travel through an operational guide and various other resources that they can hop on board and be part of a nationally branded scheme. Next slide, please. We are delivering a framework, as I said, with an operational guide, and that's supporting providers and potential providers to get Park Active, to have this signage on their car parks that signify to anyone driving around, well, that's a place I can park up, cycle and walk to my final destination. It might be a town centre, it might be a hospital, it might be a tourist destination, all of those places where parking is oversubscribed. There's branding guidelines in there, and as an incentive for anyone who's on the call who is an operator, we will be charging a fee for accreditation, but it is free over the next 2 months to get some scale up. Next slide, please. There you can see in Colchester how it works in terms of partnership with My Permit. You get a reduced parking tariff if you pick a Park Active site, and there's DFT approved signage that we've developed to indicate where it is. And next slide. I encourage you to all get involved in that initiative, Park Active, and I look forward to taking any of your questions about the British Parking Association and certainly what we are trying to support in EVs with our members. Over to the next speaker, or Chris. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julian. So as Julian mentioned there, we're also running a Q&A as part of this. So if anyone has any questions at any time, please put them in the Q&A, and we will either, if there's time, answer them at the end of each speaker, but we've also allotted some time at the end. So I'll now pass over to Sarah from Element Energy.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm going to talk you through the local authority journey to being EV enabled. And you'll all be aware of the climate emergency that's been happening across the UK, and the declaration that's been going on a national level as well. So the national net zero target for meeting carbon emissions is now in law. And there's also the national policy to end the sale of internal combustion engine cars in 2030. In addition to these national policies, local authorities across the UK have declared climate emergencies and set their own net zero targets. And you can see the dates on the map on the left, and these range from dates that are really quite soon and very urgent, so 2024, all the way through to the national policy date, which is 2050. And meeting these net zero targets will be extremely challenging given the UK's reliance on fossil fuels in today's society. But one way that's key for reducing emissions is through transport and through encouraging local residents to go to electric vehicles. So local authorities have quite a lot of say in the charging infrastructure that's deployed in the local area. And you can see from these maps today that there has been a significant increase in the number of charge points that are currently installed in the UK, the majority of which you'll see from the maps is fast and rapid charge points. These are about 7 to 25 kilowatts rating, and there's about 21,000 of these installed in the UK today. But nonetheless, despite there being quite a significant improvement in the infrastructure deployed, there is still more that needs to be done to ensure that drivers can go to EV and get charged when they need it. Next slide, thank you. So where does Element Energy fit into this picture? Well, we're a consultancy and we're dedicated to net zero carbon projects. We work across the range of the energy sector, and we help develop strategies for both private and public sector clients and all aspects relating to net zero. And I'm specifically involved in the low carbon transport team. And what we do is we work across the whole of the transport sector and range of vehicle types and also fuel types as well. So on the next slide, you'll see the range of the work that we do. And those highlighted in yellow are really related to the work, to the conversation today. So we help do electric vehicle stock modelling and charge point demand analysis for local authorities and city regions. We look at deployment strategies for a range of kind of local authority clients, but also for private clients. We help with infrastructure deployment support, so looking at site assessments and evaluating the grid connection that would be required. And we also do look at the business case and do some cash flow modelling. So one good example of this work that Element has done is for Birmingham City Council. And you'll see a map on the right now, and this shows a heat map of where the priority deployment areas for rapid charge points should be located based on our model and our analysis. And to do this, we combine a variety of data sets, including taxi driver journeys and taxi houses and where they live. And if they don't have access to off-street parking and charging, we really highlight this as a priority area for the installation of rapid charge points for taxi drivers. So moving on, at Element Energy as well, we split the electric vehicle charge point market into 6 main types, which are listed on the slide here. And I'm just going to focus on the ones on the left-hand side today. And that's because the way that people charge at the moment, the priority charge point type really is at home. So if you have an electric vehicle today, generally you'll do most of your charging at your house. And that's because you have a driveway or garage, you install a charge point and you can really conveniently charge your car. And it's also cheap because you access your home electricity tariff. So you can charge your car really with kind of not much extra hassle at all. And that really begs the question, well, what do we do for those people that don't have access to driveways or garages and make it equitable for them and their charging opportunities? And at Element, we see there's kind of 2 options, and they're not exclusive, but they are different. And the first one is residential charging hubs. And this is where you would install a group or a cluster of rapid charge points close to the residential area in which people live. And the idea would be that residents would charge their car close to where they live. They wait about half an hour or less than half an hour, and they'd come back to the house and then they would park and leave their car. Whereas the alternative method is residential on-street charging. And this is different, and this is the priority and the focus of the conversation today. And that's where local authorities would install charge points on the street outside where people live. And generally these are slower charge points. And the idea is that residents would park and their car overnight on the street where they live and charge overnight, and the car will be ready in the morning when they go to work or do their daily activities. So this kind of green highlight is what we're talking about today. And then when speaking to local authorities, there is obviously a lot of questions that come up about installing on-street residential charging solutions, because it is a new technology area, and it's not kind of, the knowledge isn't well known necessarily about all the different charge points available. So hopefully the next couple of slides will really help clear up some of the questions that I often get asked when speaking to local authorities. The first question is around funding. So how can local authorities pay for this infrastructure? And there are 2 main funding aspects that I'd like to note. So the first one is on-street residential charge point scheme, or ORCS. And this is a significant pot of money that's available from the government. About 30 million has been available to date. And this funding is to help local authorities with the cost of procurement and the installation of on-street charge points for residential use. So it's very specific for on-street residential charge points. The other funding pot is called the Transitioning Towards Zero Emission Vehicles funding, which was made available last week. So it's very new funding pot, and this was recently launched for innovative projects that develop infrastructure solutions to support zero emission vehicles. So it's slightly different to the ORC scheme in that a business needs to lead the project, but local authorities can get involved, and there's a specific scope challenge that's related to installation of charge points in residential areas. So if you've not aware of these funding types before, I'd really encourage you to look online and see what the eligibility criteria is for applying for this funding. The other aspect of my slide I'd like to talk through is the key criteria that local authorities need to consider when they're installing on-street charging. And a poll's just come up, so if you can answer this as I'm going through. Obviously, the key one is value for money. So ensuring that you as a local authority install charge points in your local area at the lowest cost, but also with greatest value for money. So getting the best number of charge points you can for that amount. The other aspect that's really important and has become more prevalent in recent months is limited street clutter and installing charge points on the street that don't really change the way that users use the street. And a key criteria for this is really looking at disabled users, blind users, and also pushchair access, and making sure that any infrastructure doesn't impact that accessibility on the street. Another aspect related to this is the overall design of the solution. So are you installing a charge point that's not causing too much visual pollution, or making sure that it blends in with the overall landscape of the street? And this is specifically a concern in conservation areas. Another point is integration with the grid. So ensuring that you install charge points that don't impact your local network or don't require expensive grid reinforcement. And then finally, a key one for the discussion today is the impact on parking. And obviously parking pressure is a huge concern for various local authorities in the UK today, and Julian alluded to it earlier. And it's something that really needs to be solved hand in hand with installing electric vehicle infrastructure on streets. And the way that some electric vehicle charge points are installed today is by using a dedicated bay. So this means that you'd have a charge point, you have a dedicated bay associated with it, and it means that only electric vehicles could park in that space. And this is brilliant because it means you get better utilization of charge points, and it means you don't ever get a petrol car blocking the space that electric vehicle would need to use the charge point. However, there are some disadvantages, and the first one is that a costly traffic regulation order was needed, and this also takes quite a lot of time for the council to complete and requires consultation. And the other one is that there's tension between electric vehicle drivers and petrol diesel drivers. And we know today that electric vehicle drivers are still very much in the minority. So if there's a space that's available just for EVs, but there's no one parking in there, that really does wind up petrol and diesel drivers, and often lots of complaints are there made to the council. So we really need to weigh up the pros and cons when installing these different technology solutions. So I'll take you through some of the options that are available for dedicated on-street charge point installations, and there's four main types I've included on this slide here. So the first is lamppost chargers, and this is where you essentially just retrofit a charge point onto an existing lamppost and tap into the electricity supply. And this is a brilliant solution because it's low cost and it doesn't add to it doesn't add to street clutter on the street. You just put the charge point onto the lamppost. However, the kind of disadvantages or the concerns really are that obviously you can only do this where there are lampposts that can be retrofitted with a charge point, and you can't have lampposts that are set back from the pavement edge, because this means that there will be a cable crossing the street, and that creates a trip hazards in the local authority. The next option is a Bollard Charger. So these are kind of more standard charge points that you would see around, but they are quite big and have bulky infrastructure, which does affect this accessibility issue, but they are capable of faster charging speeds. And I should also note that these are always installed with a dedicated parking bay to allow access to the charger. The next type are low profile chargers, and I've included a range of options here. The first one is the Urban Electric pop-up charger, which is retractable with into the pavement. So when there's no cars charging, it's just flat and flush with the pavement. There's Connected Curbs Armadillo, which is a small kind of humped charge point at the pavement edge, which again has a low profile, reducing street clutter. And then also in this category, you've got the Trojan Energy solution, which Hugh will talk about in a bit more later. But essentially, this is a flat and flush connector. So when there's no car charging at the pavement edge, you just have a flat pavement. And then in order to charge, the user uses a lance to enable charging. And then the final option is electric vehicle charge channels. And this is kind of a low innovation solution, but worth including because I do know that they are installed today in some local authorities. And this would involve a user parking in front of their house, accessing their home charge point or the home electricity and trailing their cable from their house to their car. But in order to make that safe, you dig a cable gully and you lay the cable in the gully, cover it up so there's no trip hazards. So that's kind of, like I said, a lower innovation solution, but one that is being installed today, but you do require that driver to park in front of their house every time. So that's kind of a summary of the market today, and hopefully given you a bit more information on what needs to be considered when installing different residential charge points. And now I'll hand over to Trojan to take you through their solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. We also just had a quick question, so keep them coming in as well from everyone there. But the quick question there was, can you advise what is the charge speed of the Lamppost Chargers?
So Lamppost Chargers are generally slow charge points. They range for about kind of 3 to 5 kilowatts, and it depends upon the electricity that's obviously spare capacity from the lamppost, but they are the slowest charge point types. Okay,
great. So we've got some other questions that might take a bit of a longer answer. We'll do at the end, but keep them coming in, and we'll do a quick Q&A at the end of all the presentations. So now we'll pass over to Hugh from Trojan Energy.
Okay, so thank you, Sarah and Chris. I'm going to explain how a combination of different technologies can address some of these challenges with on-street charging. So as Sarah said, there's typically when councils are trying to come up with solutions for installing EV chargers, the first thing they do is get the EV requests for installs. People are requesting to the council, I've just bought an EV, or I'm thinking about getting an EV. Can I get a charge point installed beside me? And they take that information and they integrate it with other information from the likes of even Uber, some company we're working with, or the likes of where there's been EV sales and hotspots, and you can integrate this data and you can identify areas for where you need to install chargers. But once you've identified the areas, typically the next stage is to go out and do a survey of the street. And so when they do a survey of the street, they're typically looking for, as Sarah said, can we use lamppost chargers? Are they on the right side? And if not, is this an appropriate place for a build out for a rapid charger, for example? Or will we use traditional on-street charging posts? And they're weighing up all these options and looking at the potential solutions. What's the best way to get that EV charging infrastructure into the street? But all these solutions have upsides and downsides. You know, rapid chargers, I have an electric vehicle, and it's great to be able to nip to a rapid charger and get that charging. But, you know, they quite often in the centre of cities need a build out to achieve. And then the traditional charging posts have a lot of infrastructure associated with that creates that clutter that Sarah was talking about. Then there's people taking matters into their own hands, which is obviously unacceptable, running cables down pavements, and you know, some of the across pavements is the problem with these is the safety aspect of it. So there's a number of solutions out there. All of them have advantages and disadvantages. What we're doing at Trojan is trying to bring something there that solves some of these problems and tries to help solve the solution, bringing on-street charging to residential areas with less of these clutter problems. So we're just going to bring up a poll, if you could bring up the poll, Chris. And it was just to have I'll give you sort of 5-10 seconds to have a look at this poll, and it's in your area, all areas will be different, but in your area, what would make the biggest difference for being able to persuade people to get into to buying EVs quicker? Which kind of charging is the most suitable? So we'll let you vote on that. I will continue. So the way we've addressed this problem is to develop a flat and flush charger that sits at the edge of the pavement, and there's now no clutter with this charging point. And it's very simple to use, as this video shows. So essentially, the charge point is slid into a subsurface sleeve that's in the ground, and that sits in the ground, and we have 15 of these charge points going all the way up the street, and they're flat and flush. They can be driven over or walked over, and to use them, a user presents their lance, which unlocks the connector. They can push the connector in, it's locked in place, they plug into their car, and they can get a charge. Very quick and simple to get a connection. And then they can get 22 kilowatt charging 3-phase or smart charging options, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then to unlock the lance, they unlock their car, it detects that signal, they can pull the lance out, and the lance is stored in their car. And it allows the user to do charging without any, when there's no charging going on, there's no clutter on the street. Now, having 15 charge points connected back to one grid connection gives us some big advantages for saving cost, because traditional on-street charging can be, the on-street charging posts that you see at the end of a street can be very expensive, because you need, the grid connection, but then you also need the EV-only bays. And by avoiding both, we can help really drive down the cost. And the way we avoid doing many more grid connections is we use what we call cloud arbitrated charging. So a user can basically in a smartphone app or on their computer, they can choose their preferences. So somebody might say, charge me 22 kilowatts whenever I plug in, fastest rate, that's what I want. And somebody else may say, charge me at the cheapest rate, just make sure I'm charged by 7 o'clock in the morning. And our system shares out that power and allocates the right amount of power to the right person, so that we can share out the power and we don't need to have so many cabinets needed for grid connections. So we can keep the infrastructure down, and that keeps the cost down and it keeps the clutter down. It also allows us, because we're doing this, the cloud communication allows us to do options like virtual driveway, where, for example, if somebody was on a Octopus Energy EV tariff on their home electricity bill, they could get the cost of the electricity put onto their home electricity bill, just at the cost of their home electricity bill. And that, so if they get 5 pence per kilowatt hour during the night, they can still get that, and they can pay us a subscription, and that allows us to really reduce the cost of charging for people, especially people doing high mileage, like the Uber drivers I was talking about. People can use pay-as-you-go as well, but for some people doing high mileage, this is a way to really drive down the cost of their charging. We also have protections built in for the local grid. As Sarah was saying, that's going to become more and more important. Even Lamppost Chargers are connected through the lamppost back to the electricity grid. And as more pieces of equipment are connected in to allow more people to charge, the local electricity grid, especially during peak time, is going to be under more stress. Now, smart charging, incentivizing people to charge during the night, that will take care of a lot of that, but we need to make absolutely sure that we don't ever have that peak that really damages the low voltage electricity grid. So we're working on a project with Bays and a number of others to allow us to take that demand down and back up again automatically when a peak comes through, and the local DNO can ask for that throttling and back up again. So that's another piece of protection in the local grid. And then with simple maintenance, we can basically, if there's a problem, we can pull the connector out, put a new connector in, and that allows us to do that maintenance away from the street. So these are some of the advantages of our technology. And right now, this is new technology. We're working on a program with Innovate UK. We're installing 150 of these chargers in Brent and Camden in the summer. And we're working through this program of testing and installation to make sure we're ready to go for when we get to the summer with Brent and Camden. And so here you see a test in the rain, and we've been working with grit and ice and all the conditions you're going to expect on the street. On the right-hand side here, you see some of our base units, the sleeves, which you see on the left there, installed on Purvis Road. So they're very, very low profile. They take very little room once installed on the street. And so I was there recently, and as I was talking to somebody, I was walking over them before I realised we were there. They're very low profile, and the point is we don't add to that street clutter, but they can be used when people need to charge. And the problem we're going to have is that we're not going to use EV-only bays. So we had to think outside the box in terms of what are we going to do for the solution of stopping icing? Because we're going to have 15 charge points, and no council is ever going to say, here, have 15 EV-only bays. You know, they'll not get that through. So we've had to think outside the box, and this is where the de-icer system comes in. So with de-icer, we're installing the Cleverciti sensors on the lampposts. And now we're looking down the street, and we're detecting in real time where there's movements on the parking in the street. And because we can sense in real time where there's been movement, we can also detect where we also have historical data. Sorry, is that video stopped for you guys as well, Chris? Oh no, it's still moving. We have historical data built up, which shows there's historical data which we could then use to help us do things like build virtual queues, and that allows people to know when they would expect a charging bay to become available, and we can give this in real time to our users through our app, so that they can tell when bays are going to become available, or when a bay just has become available. Because as people leave to take their kids to scouts or an evening, patterns will build up in the data. And this is where the data is important. We can start to build up these patterns, and we can start to understand when bays become available and let the EV users know that. So there's sort of two aspects to this. The first aspect is giving EV drivers a real advantage over other drivers. So letting them know when bays become available, or doing the virtual queue, which makes their user experience better. But the other side of it, which is important, is incentivization. You know, incentivizing EV drivers to move off when they don't need it, but even getting to the point where we incentivize ICE drivers not to park there if they don't have to, and be able to get rewards for that. Now, we're not going to be able to persuade everybody. You know, that's going to be life. But if we can persuade more and more people, and especially as the transition accelerates and more people move to EV, we can change some of that behavior, what's going on in the street, and use the data from Cleverciti and our own system to figure out what incentives work best, some monetary, some not monetary, to persuade people to allow these charge points to be shared. And sharing is what's important, because EV infrastructure without subsidies is going to require good utilization. And in the end, we need to get to the point where without needing ORCs, without needing all this money from the government, we can install these and still make money, whether that's owned by us or owned by the council, or owned by a private partnership. We need to get to the point where people share these things, and that means there's less disruption, less digging on the streets, higher revenues for the people who own it, but better experience for customers and a more satisfying user experience. So this is technology we believe that will help change behaviors and help improve utilization of our equipment, and we believe this is something that can potentially be used for other charging technologies as well. But I'll let Chris and David get into that with their system. So yeah, thanks for that. I can see the results there. Yeah, we agree. I mean, residential on-street charging is very important, but it's difficult to solve. It's a hard problem to solve. So that's what this is what we're trying to address with this. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. We had one quick question there, which was, what width does this require from the edge of the carriageway?
Well, it's from, yeah, so from the edge of the curb, there's a 400 mil that you're supposed to be away from the edge of the carriageway by regulations. So, you know, we sit from the edge of the curb 400 mils in, and that's regulations that affect that. Although the regulations really are there to stop people damaging their car as they open it into on-street infrastructure. And there's an argument over whether, you know, somebody will be parking and then putting it there. It's kind of different, but that's what the regulations are.
Okay, brilliant. So there's some more questions, but we will answer them at the end. And any we don't get to, we will pass them to the right people and follow up following the event.
No
so now we're going to talk about the Cleverciti side and sort of tie in how the parking data can help with electrification and beyond. So Sarah mentioned at the start that there's a real climate emergency across the whole of the UK. And, you know, this is due to parking being an issue of that as well. So 95% of the time a car is parked, so which causes huge parking pressure on urban environments. So we've conducted studies, and 44 hours is wasted by people searching for parking spaces, and that search causes 1.3 kilos of CO2 emitted just by looking for the parking space, which in the UK alone has a £23.3 billion loss just caused by people circling around looking for parking spaces. But what this also does is cause negative behaviour. So 34% of drivers will either park illegally or completely stop there. There we go. Dog's heard to the postman. So he will completely resort to bad behaviour and even cancel their journey. So this isn't just the UK either. This is economic loss across the whole of Europe. You can see there 45 billion in Germany and 72 billion in the US. And 30% of those CO2 emissions are caused by traffic themselves. So how does this affect EV charging on parking? So as we said, parking spaces are already oversubscribed, and it's just Hugh alluded to, in terms of just having EV specific bays, that's when we start putting even more pressure on those parking areas. So 60% of drivers have no access to home charging. So that means we really need to be using data and using innovative solutions to be able to choose where we're putting those locations. And changing spaces to be only, it's just going to cause further disruption and further emissions. So we're just going to talk about how parking data can help when choosing those charging locations. So we have a number of streams that you will have today in your local authority, and you might not have them at the moment. So, you know, payments, majority of local authorities are taking payments for their parking. So that gives you a real wealth of, you know, the areas that are being overutilized, areas being underutilized, the areas where you're generating the most money. But you also have charging requests. So when people are looking for EV enabled areas, permits, you know exactly how many permits there are, and obviously the enforcement side of it as well. But the thing we're going to talk about now is the smart parking aspect and how we can help with the journey from during EV enablement, post it, and before. So I'll pass over to David now, who's going to discuss charging and the relation of smart parking.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, the wonders of COVID webinars. We get the dog is the feature.
Yeah, absolutely. Who says dog people look like postmen? I don't know.
Indeed. So as Chris was talking about, data is really crucial. I mean, I think we all know it's impossible to manage anything if you don't really understand it in the first place. And so at Cleverciti, we've developed a suite of sensors and parking guidance solutions. And really the core of the data generation is this sensor that Hugh mentioned earlier that uses AI and edge computing to observe the street and keep track of each individual parking space. Is that parking space occupied or not? And by deploying these around a city, you get a view kind of like this, where you can now see throughout all the streets in the authority where are the available parking spaces and where are they not, and then track that data over time. And so you can get historical trending, and you can start to see you know, where are the areas that are underutilized, that are overutilized. And so when you're thinking about siting EV chargers, that's one way that you could use this data. You could look at the trends over time and say, hey, this particular street corner tends to be, it's very conveniently located to a lot of residents, but it also doesn't have the level of occupancy of other areas. And so let's cite that there, because we'll be more likely to be able to get high utilization of the chargers. We can also layer in payment data. And so at the bottom of this chart, you can see a sort of blue line that shows the payment rate compared to the occupancy level. And so in this particular city, the payment rate is actually not quite good. And so by understanding the payment rate, you can do things like guide enforcement, but you can also understand, what's the revenue that particular spaces are generating. And then also you have that data inform your decisions and how you site EV chargers. And then of course you can compare, week by week or day by day or area versus area to try to better understand exactly what sort of options are available for EV chargers. And then all that data really funnels back into the core platform, which can then of course be used in real time to guide drivers to the parking. So once you've deployed the data, of course, you're not just going to use it for EV charging, siting, you're going to use it to really manage the whole parking environment of the city. And Chris is going to tell you a little bit about that.
So at the moment, it's the argument we're sort of facing is how do we influence parking and charging being two separate commodities, basically. So, when a car is fully charged, we don't want that car to then block an EV bay, we want them to move on and find alternative parking where they can end their parking journey, which is obviously the 95% of the time when that vehicle's in a bay. So what we're trying to use is real-time data to influence the whole journey that an EV car or even an ICE car is going on. So that starts with being guided from home to an available space. So when you're making your decision, what we want to do is give people exactly real-time data to say, right, this is where there's a space, this is where I'm going to be able to charge my car, this is where I'm going to be able to park my car. So you see at the bottom of this sign here, this is in one of our installations in Germany, where we know exactly how many EV spaces are. But obviously that also correlates to the rest of the parking asset to know, right, once I finish charging, I can move out into a normal parking bay to allow others to also charge in that location. What that also means is when we're talking about what Julian was talking about in terms of mobility hubs, is that we can then provide the data to let people park and charge on the outskirts of town and then use other methods of transport to get in there. Say their chosen EV area in the urban environment isn't available. So that means we're encouraging them to, first of all, from home go, right, is there an EV space in the centre of town? No, there is in the mobility hub. That's fine. I can park there, charge my car, I can walk, cycle, get the train, get an e-scooter, whatever it might be to get into that further journey. But say you did want to go into the urban environment to park and charge, or you're a resident of an urban environment, what we're trying to do is also give people guidance at street corners. So you can see here, this is another one of our installations where we tell exactly how many parking spaces are available on each intersection. So this could also be included here with an EV icon, which would say, right, straight on, I know exactly how many EV cars there. And what we're trying to do with this local guidance is get 100% adoption. So people are always using guidance. So we have an application that can be put into payment apps or whatever city apps. But what we want to do is make sure that 100% of people are being guided. So we're having the maximum use of reducing those emissions. But obviously with digital parking guidance, if you're a local user who's using it regularly, it means that we can guide you straight from where you are to the nearest available space or nearest available charging location to your destination. And then also link that easily with mobile payments. So you can see here, we've got an EV icon, we've got a disabled user icon. So it's really user friendly. And again, trying to reduce that search traffic. And then the final piece of the puzzle is this use of real-time data in partnership with EV charging infrastructure, as Hugh has mentioned. So we want to encourage the correct use of space. So we want to have a parking bay, but we also want to have charging bays. But we want to make sure that people aren't parking when they could be moving around the corner and charging their car. So doing that by incentivizing EV drivers to vacate their space when they're fully charged, this avoids bay hogging, and also notifying the EV drivers waiting to charge of the available bays that are free, which is key to being able to roll out the electrification. So last year there was 6.7% of all the vehicles registered were EV cars. That means there's a lot of ICE cars out there. So how can we look at that and say, right, in the interim, how do we use data to make that, first of all, better for people to park, but also for people better to charge? And so we can have this synergy in an urban environment that doesn't cause any more sort of bad emissions and bad congestion in these urban environments. So the poll's just been released there. And just a question there asking about what your highest priority for investment in the parking infrastructure is. So please vote for that. And then we will jump straight into the Q&A for the last 10 minutes. Okay. Too many screens open. Cool. So I welcome all of the panelists back. And we will jump into a Q&A. So I will find the first question here, which would be, what recommendation / regulation actually stipulates 400 mil from the face of the curb? So I guess that's for Hugh.
I don't have it to hand. I'll have to send it to, I think it came to us through the councils, to be honest. So, you know, they said, you know, this is what it's going to have to be. But let me, if you're on an attendee list, I'll get you the answer to that, and we'll put it back to you. Because yeah, I know it's right, but I think, like I say, it's more of a recommendation. We've been working with UKPN and others to. You know, some of the things we're changing some of the sizes, you know, of cabinets and whatnot, because some of these are old-fashioned pieces of legislation that's or standards that have been out there for a while that need to be updated, and this could well be one of them. But I will get that to you.
Perfect. So we have one here which is saying local planning and resident objections could be a barrier to installation of on-street EV charging units. Should there be a review of planning policy? I guess that might be one for you, Sarah.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, so we are aware that kind of councils have to work together to install technology that suits the best case for local residents. In terms of planning policy, local authorities really do have the autonomy to decide what chargers they want to install. So it's really down to ensuring that there's engagement with the local authority and the local residents to ensure that the best technology solution is installed. We know today that there is really high demand for on-street charge points, particularly in built-up areas, and various councils have ways of collecting these residential requests. So you can really identify the key streets which charge points should be installed on. And once you've identified those streets, you'll know that residents want the charge points. So the next case is just understanding which technology best suits the street. And then that is really down to the council and the charge point operators working together to figure out what chargers to install.
Brilliant. So we've got a slightly longer question from Manny here. He says, I believe that to encourage much faster uptake of EVs, several challenges need addressing urgently. As far as I can see, by far the highest challenge is the extra cost of 30 to 50% of purchasing or hiring EVs compared to ICE cars. And this is a matter for the government and manufacturers. Another major challenge is the very poor deployment of EV chargers in residential areas to serve and encourage those without off-street parking to make the transition to EV. But not least the current cost of charging infrastructure, which can vary between £7 for charging at home or an overnight tariff. She said, how does the panel think these challenges can be met? So I guess we've got about the trying to get people to adopt EV cars, and then also about the residential charging aspect.
I think
Stop.
Oh,
sorry.
I was just going to say a key point that I was going to pick up on was the last point, which is the difference in prices that the consumers can really pay to charge their car. So I think that the numbers quoted there were kind of between £7 and £40, say, and that really does bring us back to what charge points are being installed in the local area. Hughes talked about a solution, virtual driveway, and how we could potentially pair up charge point solutions to home electricity tariffs. So you're giving drivers on the street the same benefits that people with driveways actually do have as well. So really trying to ensure that it is equitable. I think that is a priority for charge point operators and local authorities. We don't want to have to charge people extortionate amounts to charge their vehicle, because it's not fair compared to the people that get to charge at home.
The large part of that, though, is that you have to drive down the cost of the infrastructure, because it has to be paid for. Now, some of it comes from government grant, but some of it still has to be paid for. So by driving that cost down, you can afford to allow people to do things like virtual driveway and have cheaper bills for charging. Sorry, Julian.
Yeah, I was just going to, as I mentioned in my presentation, I hear about all sorts of great examples of how these things are being addressed. So you've got the Park and Charge in Oxford. You've got other schemes where housing estates have got together and put together a car club that is just for EVs, so that you don't have to own the car, and you've got all the charging infrastructure set up for that. And the other, I think, thing that Manny is pointing towards is perhaps at the moment, data isn't easily accessed by the user. I think in the future, there's going to be more interoperability, more need for DNOs, for charge point operators, everyone to share their data, so that the consumer has more knowledge and power as to where to go to get the best offer and so on. At the moment, it's not so easy, but I think that will change in the future.
That's a good sort of segue into another question. And again, this is from my point of view, as Julian mentioned it about the parking platform and making it easier for consumers to pay for parking and having a single layer that, as a consumer, you can access everything. And the question is, with the multitude of EV charge point providers, what is the vision to provide customers with a single view as each CPO tends to operate within their own ecosystems? So I think that's, again, we talk about parking and EV, and I think that is a potential learning that the EV infrastructure can look at parking right now and say, this is what's happened 15 years later with mobile payments. Would the EV charge point providers put that in at the same time? I don't know, Hugh and Sarah, you probably have more of a
one of the things we intend to do is to have mobile public lances beside our cabinets, essentially, that users can essentially tap out with a card and then take the lance, do their charging, put it back. So there's a pay-as-you-go system that you don't need even an app, but by accessing the app, and it's really, we don't want to make too many of that, because we're really targeting residential on street charging, and you don't want 15 people turning up to charge on a street where there's already parking pressure. You have to be careful to manage that well. It's really for the local residents to be able to charge, and there'll be parking permits in the areas often where we are anyway. But yeah, you need to have access for people to come and visit and be able to charge. But control that, in the residential areas.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, there's kind of two ways I envisage the charging scenarios going in the future. And one is providing that network across the UK so that you can charge en route. And in order to do that, making sure that that is interoperable so that you can pay as you go, you can pay with your card, you don't need to access the multitude of apps that are out there today. I know EV drivers today often come to me and say, I've got 12 different apps, it's a nightmare. So ensuring that that's interoperable, but also then ensuring that kind of the home residential charge points that are used, there might be different local authorities using different technology types, but the idea is that you as a resident would have a dedicated charge point type. So it might be a Trojan, it might be a Lamppost, it might be a Bollard, but you have your primary charge point type, which you use to do your overnight charging or your local charging. And then you also have the network across the UK when you go to other areas. And that's kind of the way that I see the charge point market helping to develop in the future.
Okay, great. So we'll just nip one more question in there.
Chris, I was just thinking there's a great segue here, because Sarah was talking really about guidance and apps and how how do you find your EV charger, or how do you find even a normal parking space? And there was a question from Thomas Sutton about 100% of all trip guidance is ambitious. How is 50% being mitigated to retain user experience?
Yeah, that's
I think
answer.
The key point there is that if you just have an app, that what we've seen is a good take rate is 10 or 20% for the app. And if you want everyone to follow the guidance, or at least many people to follow the guidance, you want to have digital signage as well. And so being able to show throughout a city, here's a way to get to a free EV bay, here's a non-EV bay, so you can steer traditional drivers to a different street is really crucial.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Well, that's the end of the time we've got today. So any of the unanswered questions, we will send them to the panelists and get them to to send over their answers to you so you don't miss out. But thank you very much for attending. And yeah, we had some great speakers there. So please get in touch with all of them to find out a bit more about their solutions and how they can help your local authority in getting EV enabled. So thanks again. Thanks again to all the panelists, and hopefully see everyone soon at an event in person rather than Zoom screens.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye. Bye.